and thank you for joining our Teaching for 21st Century webinar brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glassell Gang. I'm your host, Annie Cyrus. Please use the Q&A box on your screen if you have any questions, and I promise we will get to them as soon as our very special guest presentation is done. With that being said, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our guest this evening, Daniel Greenfield, is the Shellman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the editor and writer of the blog, The Point. Hi, Daniel. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Annie, for that great introduction. Thank you for carrying out hosting duties yet again. We are here to discuss an American coup. Coups used to be things that happened in other countries. Now they're happening in America. I mean, we import so much from the rest of the world. We imported coups as well. Now, there's some good news, though. The good news here, and it is very good news, is that the corporations, AT&T, Comcast, and Disney, carried out their constitutional duty of selecting the president through their media outlets. CNN, owned by AT&T, Comcast, which owns NBC and MSNBC, and Disney, which owns ABC News. They carried out their constitutional duty, and they very helpfully selected a president for us, one that serves their financial interests, one that serves their political interests, and not ours. But the good news is that Americans are not just going to take it, and the good news is that President Trump and so many Republicans are not just taking it. You know, in the past, when there have been stolen elections, what did Nixon do about a stolen election in Chicago? Well, nothing. He ultimately decided that for the good of the country, he should just keep quiet. And when Democrats tried to steal an election in Florida, if the difference between Gore and Bush had been Gore's way, do you really think that Bush and some of the same Republican lawyers who became judges, who became prominent figures, would have actually fought this in court, would have taken it to the Supreme Court? Frankly, I doubt that very much. I mean, I would like to believe that, but I doubt it very much. The bottom line is we now actually have a president, we have a conservative movement that is ready to fight this. Now, before I continue, I'm going to split off on a little bit of a tangent. Has anybody here had their wallet stolen? Anybody? You can type an answer in the chat. Yeah? Annie, you've had your wallet stolen. Anybody had their wallet pickpocketed in the United States? Anywhere else? So the thing about having your wallet stolen in the United States is it's a lot less glamorous, because the art of pickpocketing is kind of going out of style. It used to be a very complicated affair, but these days not as many people carry cash, people carry credit cards, so you don't really have the complicated gang structure. Somebody just sticks their hand in your pocket, they walk away with your wallet, and that's it. Now in Europe, in Asia and parts of the world, you have very complicated situations. You have pickpocketing gangs. Now I'm going somewhere with this. So when you have these pickpocketing gangs, what happens is that, yes, there is one guy who actually steals your wallet. Sometimes it's two people, but there is a whole setup here to distract you, to divert your attention from what's actually happening. So for example, and this is a very popular one, there's something called the stall. What happens with the stall is there's one guy in front of you who just kind of gets in the way, he distracts you, somebody else bumps into him, there's an argument, there's a whole fight over it, and meanwhile a third guy, a fourth guy is actually stealing your wallet and you never even notice it. And some of these more complicated gangs, particularly the ones operating in France and Italy, they can have 12 people, they can have 14 people. It becomes a very complicated affair. There's a bunch of people there to distract you from the beginning. There are two people who actually steal your wallet. One of them actually cuts into your pocket. He's called the mechanic. The other one actually is the one who takes the money. He passes it to a third guy. Then there are a few guys afterwards to get in your way if you actually try to stop and scream, "My money's been stolen." Those guys will then claim innocent. We don't have the money. The money's not in our hands. You can search us. We don't have the money. Now, there's an obvious relevance here. So we've got the election theft, but it's a multi-level election theft. So first of all, you've got the people who are actually out there distracting us. They're the people who are actually out there intimidating us, and other people who are stealing votes. Now, they're all members of the same gang. That gang symbol, I believe, is a jackass. The gang is known as the Democrat Party. But they're also the people who actually are stealing it, and they're the core. They're the core of the election theft, and that is also happening on multiple levels. But it begins really with the setup, which is the stall, which is the part where they actually distract you, divert your attention. They set the battle space. Pickpockets don't so much think in terms of the battle space, but on a level that we're dealing with, we're talking about stealing a country, we're talking about stealing the free world. They are very much thinking in terms of the battle space. So the first sign of the battle space was the polls. Now, a number of conservatives have been going, these polls are complete nonsense. They got everything wrong. No, they got everything entirely right. The polls were operating on two levels. And the most important part of that level was that they were creating the perception that Biden was going to win. I mean, if you're going to steal a whole bunch of money, and this is something that happens in corporations, you create the perception that this company is very, very profitable. You cook the books. You get the idea that, yes, sure, this company has $1 million to burn. It has $100 million to burn. It has $1 billion to burn. This company is making a lot of money. That's what the polls were doing. They were saying that, of course, Biden is going to win. The Democrats are going to win. There's a ton of money here. Pay no attention to all the signs showing that there's something wrong with this company. This company has a lot of money to burn. Now, the big issue actually happened around Election Day because the Republicans were focused on in-person voting. The Democrats wanted mail-in voting. Now, obviously, with mail-in voting, you have multiple opportunities for fraud. But one of the reasons they did not want in-person voting, and this is a big issue, is they wanted to create the perception that, yes, Biden was going to win. Now, if you have a whole bunch of Republicans coming in and voting for President Trump, that perception falls apart, which is what began happening right before the election. Suddenly, the same Democrats have been saying, mail-in voting, don't vote in person, it's too dangerous. We're suddenly saying, yes, go vote in person. The CDC was saying, even if you have the coronavirus, go vote in person, because it was suddenly very urgent that you actually went out and voted in person. Now, why was that? Because they understood what was going to happen. They were looking at the mail-in ballot requests. They were seeing Republicans were not ordering the mail-in ballots the way they needed to be ordering them, which is, so they knew that was going to happen. The election day was going to come, election night was going to come. And they would actually look at the voting totals, and they would see that President Trump was leading by a whole lot, which makes it a lot harder to cook the books afterward. They needed to at least create some sort of sense that there was a contest, because if you go in with President Trump leading by a whole lot, and then suddenly a whole bunch of votes come in and everything tilts the other way, it becomes really, really obvious that this is a scam. Now, this obviously happened anyway, but it didn't happen by the same kind of numbers they were worried about. They were worried about a situation where President Trump would just win by a landslide. Networks would have trouble justifying why they're refusing to call the election for him, and it would become much more challenging. So they get it a bit closer, but at the same time, it was very obvious. Election day, he's leading decisively, the Vegas odds shift, and then suddenly you have a whole bunch of votes coming in for Joe Biden. And we're going to delve into the statistics, the numbers, as to why those numbers are just so implausible and so fake. But just to understand where those polls were coming from and where the sudden push for in-person voting was coming from, they were setting the battle space. So they were the guys actually distracting the mark. And keep in mind, the mark is the American people. You were the mark. You, and for that matter, so many of the people who voted, so many people who didn't vote, so many people who think that voting makes no sense at all, and it's harder to argue with them after something like this, but it's still worth going out there and voting, because if you don't vote, then you just end up with Russia, you end up with China, you end up with Iran, you end up with countries where voting simply doesn't matter. Voting is an important way to push back. So they were creating this illusion that they were going to win, and they were creating this illusion not just for the media attention, not just for the publicity, not just to blow their own horn. They were creating this as a cover for the election theft that was going to happen. And they knew this election theft was happening. They knew it was going in. This was part of the plan. So up front, you had the polls that were distracting people. They actually began rushing people to the polls physically because they knew the theft, the scam was actually in danger. Now, what we have is the other dimension, which is the messaging part. Even before the election, the red button was pushed. Now, the red button was exactly what the big tech companies, Facebook, Google, so on, had been prepping since 2016. Because if you remember, the Democrats, they didn't challenge the voting results. Right now, they're saying the voting results, we didn't challenge the voting results. No, what they claimed was that President Trump was a Russian agent and that he was illegitimate, should be impeached because of that. So what they did not do was challenge the voting results. They challenged the whole legitimacy, and they challenged the legitimacy not just of President Trump, but the idea of free speech. Because around this time, they began introducing the term disinformation into our national politics. This is a very creepy, a very disturbing term. It's a term you associate with totalitarian countries. It's a term you expect to see in George Orwell's 1984. What does disinformation mean? Well, specifically, it means certain kinds of speech that we don't like. Now, they got the camel's nose in the tent by initially using this information to refer to some sort of Russian conspiracy or some conspiracy by foreign governments. And then now this information is just something that President Trump says, it's something that Republicans say. The White House press secretary is giving a press conference. We have to cut her off because this is disinformation. It doesn't matter how newsworthy it is, we can't possibly tolerate disinformation. Disinformation is so very, very dangerous. This is obviously so very creepy. It's creepy on so many levels, because this is something you associate with totalitarian countries. Now, what the Democrats have done is exactly what you see in dictatorships. Dictatorships will say there's no actual legitimate domestic dissent. There are just these foreign agents, these foreign operatives serving foreign governments. And these foreign governments go out there and they push agendas, and these people are collaborating with them. And this is a very totalitarian idea, because it says that everybody who disagrees with me is a foreign agent. We can investigate them for treason. At this point, this isn't news anymore, because guess what? They actually began doing this 4 years ago. Now, the other thing they began doing was using this as a basis to engage in massive censorship of social media. And one of the big problems that we're dealing with today is that the internet, which used to be a free, open space, a marketplace of ideas, became consolidated under a handful of companies. Those companies are insanely wealthy, insanely powerful, and they essentially control speech. So Facebook controls over 80% of social media discourse. Google controls over 80% of search. What Facebook doesn't control is controlled by a handful of smaller companies, but they are still hugely influential, like Twitter. Now, these companies were prepping for this for 4 years because they'd been accused of enabling President Trump. So they were doing incremental censorship in the years coming up to this, and in the weeks and the months coming up to this. But right before the election, they began pushing the red button, which meant suppressing everything. And the trigger for the red button was the Hunter Biden laptop. Once that story broke, they immediately took every effort to censor it for the very blatant reason that they did not want President Trump to win. This was the very blatant justification for it. They moved from one justification to another, but that was the bottom line. And we've seen this even beyond the Hunter Biden laptop, especially going into the election, repeated claims that this is disinformation. We're censoring this dangerous and harmful disinformation, suggesting that there's anything wrong with the election is harmful disinformation. Now you flash back to 2000, again, Bush-Gore. Democrats were given every possible stage and forum to go out there and claim that the election was illegitimate. This was not described as a conspiracy theory. This was described as patriotic. It was a way of caring and being concerned about the legitimacy of our elections. And Republicans who didn't care about the legitimacy of our elections, they were bad people. They were probably working for the Russians. Now, of course, we flipped everything, and there's insufficient evidence. These are false claims. Now, the Democrats ever present a basis for their claims? They did not. At least in 2000, they made some efforts. Their whole basis for the Russian conspiracy theories never had anything whatsoever. They never actually produced anything more than opposition research from the Clinton administration. I'm sorry, from the Clinton campaign. It never actually became the Clinton administration. But they were not censored in any way. Nobody said, you can't go on here for 5 minutes to spout claims that President Trump is a Russian agent without providing some evidence. That would never happen. That was not disinformation, even though the Steele report was based by material from Russian intelligence sources who were suspected of actually being intelligence sources. At no point in time did they say, we can't do that. This is disinformation. It's undermining the integrity of our elections. It's undermining public confidence. So, this is not a surprise to anybody. It's not a surprise to anybody at all. But there is a grotesque double standard here. And the entire term disinformation has been developed and has been used again to secure the battle space by aggressively censoring any other point of view. This is what happens in a coup. In a coup, we've seen coups before. You seize the television stations. Around here, you don't need to seize the television stations. They happily seize themselves. They're happily pro-regime to begin with. You seize control of the means of communication. You keep broadcasting claims that our dictator, the benevolent Generalissimo Biden, is now in charge, and he is the legitimately selected leader. And anybody who disagrees, please report them immediately. And we've got a list here. We've got an action list. And this list is going to assemble everybody who disagrees, and we're going to eliminate anybody who disagrees with this idea. So it's a coup. When I titled this teach-in American coup, it's not an exaggeration. This is what a coup is. You have an oligarchy, you have a group of powerful organizations, corporations, nonprofit organizations, political organizations who decided to select the winner, who decided to broadcast claims that they had selected the winner, and they held forth on this. And just to give you an example of just how convoluted the infrastructure of this is, a lot of people have been very upset at Fox News for calling the election for Joe Biden. But what was Fox News' basis for doing all this? So Fox News claims that it has some sort of special secret sauce. It's got the Fox News vote-a-thon practice. What Fox News is doing, it's using something called AP Votecast, which is the Associated Press, which is itself, by the way, a nonprofit that's controlled by typical media figures. What is AP Votecast? It comes out of the University of Chicago. You know, guys, University of Chicago is very familiar. And the University of Chicago's NORC, which is actually the basis for this voter file, is being funded by the National Science Foundation. Now, the interesting thing about the National Science Foundation is normally presidents come in, they clean house. At the National Science Foundation, the heads of the National Science Foundation are appointed for 6 years, which means that when Obama put his person in there, she was in there for much of President Trump's term, which effectively means that you had a government agency funding a academic institution, which is also a nonprofit, which was pipelined through a media nonprofit, and that data was used by Fox News to make its declaration. So this is the kind of very convoluted networks we're dealing with. This is why I describe this as an oligarchy. It's something that you tended to see really in early stages of communist organizations, and effectively this is what a lot of this is. I noticed Stephen Mix has asked a number of questions. That's exactly the case. Stephen asked if all the propaganda is being pushed out to eventually intimidate the courts and to rule against Trump. That's exactly the case. The Democrats have John Roberts' measure. They have the measure, frankly, of guys like Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. They know that if you push them enough, if you make it clear that they're not going to be welcome at cocktail parties, if they rule on this, they're going to rule the right way, which is the left way. So again, we've seen this before. We've seen this on gay marriage. We've seen this on a number of other recent rulings. We've seen this on the whole question of DACA. So the bottom line is they're creating this consensus that Biden won, that only bad people, crazy people, nut jobs will disagree with this, and they're pushing this very aggressively. One of the arms, just to segue a bit, actually, I'll go off on a tangent a little bit, is the push to actually have the GSA administrator, go ahead and start releasing resources to Biden. And they're addressing this up as Biden needs instantly. Biden needs classified briefings. Americans might die if Biden doesn't get classified briefings. Frankly, A, I doubt Biden could remember a single classified briefing. B, considering that the people around Biden are the same Obama people and even worse, it's better for those people not to have access to classified briefings. C, the whole 911 argument is that if Biden and his team don't get access to classified briefings and there's a terrorist plot coming at the United States, they won't be in a position to stop it. First of all, if there's a terrorist plot coming against the United States, they're more likely to enable it. Second of all, the bottom line is there are channels through which this can operate that are perfectly legitimate. And for that matter, Joe Biden could simply leave some of the Trump national security people in place if he cares that much about the country. Now, as far as the legal basis for the GSA turning over resources to Biden, if you go back to 2000, again, Bush Gore, the GSA administrator, who was a top Democrat donor, made it very clear that until the Supreme Court decision was settled, he was not actually turning over any GSA resources. They fought this until December. It's now just early November. There is absolutely no hurry, except that Democrats are very aggressively pushing into manufacturing a consensus. And this is exactly what they're doing. They're creating this manufactured consensus that says it's over, it's done, the election is over. And again, this is the coup element. Instead of actually going through the process, going through the motions, you know, Bush Gore, we actually went through the motions. There were recounts. Now we can't even go through the motions. We need to immediately acknowledge Biden as the president-elect, which, by the way, is a completely invented office with an invented seal. And now Joe Biden is taking phone calls with world leaders, which is arguably a violation of the law. And he's holding briefings, and he's acting like he's actually some sort of president, which again is illegal and completely inappropriate in American history. But let's leave that by the wayside. But the idea is just to get Biden embedded as much as possible, to get him accepted as much as possible as that. And at that point, it becomes a higher barrier for courts to push back, particularly the Roberts Court, and say, well, no, this isn't quite settled yet. The whole point of the American coup is for them to go ahead and say, this is now settled, it's now over, there's nothing more to discuss, there's nothing more to debate, we've settled this. Now, to get back to the main topic. So you have multi-level theft, you have a multi-level distraction, you have a multi-level pressure campaign that's being waged. It's being waged against Republican elected officials. There's a push, for example, to get Republican elected officials to congratulate Biden. You know, and Republican senators certainly are not exactly the toughest nuts to crack in this regard. You just have to ask them enough times and they'll go, well, you know, sure, why not? We can do this. It's no big deal. You get the GSA to release resources, and at that point, Biden opens his transition office. He's getting classified briefings, and at that point, it's going to be essentially treated as it's over. the coup has been won. Now let's get back a little bit, pull back a bit to the actual theft itself. We've been working on the pickpocketing part, the part where they distract you, where the blocker's there, the part where the guy who's actually the shill, the part where the guys who are actually intimidating you afterward and getting into a fight with you, and they're all a distraction. They're an important part of the theft, but there's actually also the theft itself. So a number of people have been doing great research in this regard, and it's important to understand that there is a big picture here, which is that the theft is occurring on many levels. Now, just to get back to the pickpocket metaphor, so you've got the old-fashioned pickpockets. The guys actually just stick their hand in your pocket, they stick their hand in their purse, they come away with what they're trying to steal. The old-fashioned thing, they're trying to get cash. One of the reasons pickpockets are somewhat of a fading art is because a lot of fewer people are carrying cash. More people are carrying credit cards. Even when people are carrying cash, it's not as much cash. And credit cards are their own art. So you've got also high-tech thievery, one of which is to actually get at your credit cards, get at the data. Then your cards might remain intact outwardly, but they're going to have your credit card information. So that's high-tech theft. Now, when it comes to the stolen election, we've also got this happening on multiple levels. So on one level, we've got the traditional election theft. Democrats have been stealing elections in this way pretty much forever, pretty much to the dawn of the Republic, if you go back to the Tammany Hall era. And what they do is pretty simple. What they do is they just actually introduce ballots, or they alter ballots. They throw out some ballots. I mean, we've seen videos and photos of this. We've seen affidavits of this, particularly out of Detroit and TCF. We've seen the incredibly corrupt setup in Philly. One of the photos that I recently struck me and is absolutely fantastic is actually Bob Brady, who's a former congressman, so-called mayor of Capitol Hill, who's also the head of the Philadelphia Democrat Party. And he's posing with two guys. Both of them are Democrat ward leaders in South Philly. Now, one of those guys had already been arrested and served time in prison for election fraud. The other guy this year was actually busted and arrested for election fraud. This is just the Philly Democrat Party. The corruption is absolutely mind-blowing. It is, yes. Yilma, I agree with you. I don't think Biden will remember anything. He's lucky to remember his name. They occasionally can get him to memorize entire speeches, but I wouldn't exactly trust this guy to remember sentence one of anything significant. Anyway, so they've got this entire setup prepped, and their goal here is to steal it on multiple levels. So on the one hand, you've got the physical ballot theft, the physical ballot fraud. And I mean, it's just the old-fashioned Democrat parties doing what they do. They've got their people in there. They're wearing Biden-Harris masks, and they're still counting ballots. They're physically intimidating poll watchers. They're threatening them. They're kicking them out. They're calling the police on them. Again, this is all old school stuff. And, it used to actually be worse. One of the arguments against women voting back in the 19th century was that elections were so violent, it was too dangerous for women to actually go out and vote. And this was actually true in places like New York or Philly, where there would be violent fights, and there'd be people trying to steal boxes of ballots, and people from the other party would be there, and there would be fist fights, and sometimes guns would be pulled and knives would be used, and there were entire gangs. I mean, this was stuff you don't see in gangs of New York, but the gangs of New York were very much involved in this. One of the gang members actually became mayor, Fernando Wood, one of the more infamous progressive figures. So this is the kind of old-fashioned ballot theft. It's, I'm going to punch you in the face. I'm going to take the ballots. I'm going to fill out a bunch of ballots. I'm going to rig the ballots. I'm going to use a whole bunch of dirty tricks. And of course, there's the digital election fraud, which also happens on a number of levels. People have been digging into this. And it has to be traced in other ways, including statistical analysis. Now, part of the problem, again, is this weird public-private partnership, which is that we've got a handful of companies. We've got Dominion, we've got ES&S. By the way, a number of ES&S flash drives with encrypted data were stolen in Philly before the election. One of those things that just happens, and it turns out that the ES&S machines are surprisingly easy to access, which means there was somebody out there who had encrypted data and had the ability to tamper with machines. And when they checked the voting machine, for some reason, the numbers of many of the machines did not match those on the logs. So you've got this kind of somewhat more old-fashioned, but at the bottom line is you've got massive digital possibilities for simply hacking the voting machine's results, and that's looking at things like jams. It's looking at ways of actually tabulating the data. So you've got this theft itself happening at multiple levels. You've got the old-fashioned Democrat Party theft, and you've got the increasingly sophisticated thefts. The old-fashioned thefts are just going to happen kind of regardless. They happen in every election, which is why Republicans, when they actually run for office, they have to win by the voter fraud margin. This is something Giuliani and others have talked about in the past, because you're just going to go into the election. And the bottom line is you're going into the election, you have to win by far more than the Democrats have to win. A Democrat has to just actually win the election. A Republican has to beat the amount of voter fraud that's going to happen. Now, voter fraud isn't the same across the board, but in cities where there are old line political machines, again, Philly, Detroit, very much are examples of that, where there are really these old corrupt machines, there's going to be voter fraud. In the presidential election, especially one that's potentially close, there's going to be a lot more voter fraud. And this is something that just happens all the time. We've actually seen this before. Republicans just didn't challenge it. There were, I believe, about 59 precincts in Philly when Mitt Romney ran against Obama that registered 0 votes for Mitt Romney. There were also numbers like that across the country in 2012 and 2008. And the bottom line is the stuff was happening in 2000, 2004. It's been happening for quite a long time now. Now, was there more of it in this election? That's probably the case, especially because of the sheer amount of mail-in ballots. Now, with mail-in ballots, it's just a golden opportunity to commit all sorts of frauds. Even setting aside ballot harvesting, you have a ridiculous amount of just temptation and opportunity because you've just, first of all, because of the coronavirus, you've got fewer eyes on you. You've got more ballots that are actually coming in, and you've got a system that's basically overloaded, which means it's just impossible to keep track of everything. Now, the other side of it is the voting machines. Now, voting machines, digital voting machines are, there's a number of problems with them. First of all, not all of them produce an actual physical record. Now, if there isn't an actual physical record, then you've just got data, and data is so very easy to tamper with. The idea that you can't actually tamper with data in voting machines is obviously absurd, because if you can tamper with data well enough to steal billions of dollars from international financial institutions, which has happened, then believe me, you can obviously tamper with data in voting machines. And people, even well before this, even people on the left, even Democrats, have been going out and proving that you can indeed tamper with voting machines. All the various precautions that they claim make it absolutely impossible, just make it harder. But the bottom line is that people on the inside have the easiest shot at doing it, and people who are working with these machines on any kind of regular basis are going to have an easier time of doing this. Now, as I mentioned, the theft here also occurs at multiple levels. So on the crude level, you've just got flash drives with encrypted information on there. They're just being physically stolen and being used. And you've got the actual overall data that's being inputted into various systems. And you've got ways of tampering with that data. So the key issue is what kind of record is being kept, to what extent can you access the raw data, and can you actually tabulate everything against that raw data? Because remember, when you're dealing with financial institutions, you're dealing with, first of all, with raw data, and then you're dealing with the various ways that data can be shaped and shifted. Thus, you input, let's say, $10,000 into your bank account, or $100, or 10 cents. Either way, there's a record of this, but the difference between that on the computer level is, well, in theory, it's just a bunch of zeros. When you're dealing with physical money, there's a huge physical difference between 10 cents and $10,000. On the other hand, when you're dealing with data, well, it's just data. The data can be tampered with. And at that point, it takes increasing statistical analysis. You've got to track down the traces, and you need access to those systems to be able to properly track down those traces. You can do statistical analysis, which people are doing when it comes to the data that's being output, but the data that's being output, all you're doing with that statistical analysis is saying something looks funny here, which obviously is done in financial crime cases all the time. You're applying some of those same statistical analyses and going, this doesn't actually look right, something's wrong here, we should investigate. Obviously, when it comes to financial cases, the FBI can come in and actually dig deeper. Here, I'm very skeptical that the same FBI that was actually handed out immunity agreements to Clinton Associates is going to be digging any deeper. I'm strongly skeptical of that. I think most of you are very skeptical too. Bottom line is that means at the moment what we have is very limited information. We have enough to go on to see that there's clearly stuff that is very legitimate, the stuff that is clearly wrong, stuff that would not occur naturally. But actually proving it requires getting to the raw data, it requires getting to the ballots. Now, part of the problem here, as I mentioned earlier, is you've got basically 3 companies with a lock on the voting machine business. One of them is Dominion, for example, which a lot of people are focusing on. As you can tell by the name, it's a bit of a creepy name, but in Canada, it's not a creepy name, is a Canadian company. You've got a number of others. ES&S is based out of Omaha. But a lot of those companies are also intertwined with private equity. They're intertwined with companies that have their own political agendas and their own financial agendas, because there's a whole lot of money riding on the selection. And particularly with companies that are doing business across borders or doing business for that matter with China, there is a whole lot riding on this. Even beyond the corruption, beyond the conspiracy theories, you don't always have to go to the conspiracy theories. Because bottom line is, first of all, if you're called a Snowden case, you can have somebody who's not that high up on the totem pole, but who's a technical guy who has access to the material, and that person can get access to a lot of this stuff. It doesn't have to be some big executive at a meeting who's doing this. It's easily enough possible that somebody who is technically talented, and these days a lot of the guys who are technically talented, at least are young and meaning left, can do quite a bit of damage. And beyond that, the sheer amount of misrepresentation, because a lot of these companies are insisting that their machines can't be tampered with, which means they actively try to suppress proof that they can be tampered with. And we've seen this before with companies that actually, when people came out and they showed proof of concept that this can be tampered with, they try to suppress them, they try to shut them down, they try to sue them out of business, because these companies don't really want secure voting. What they want is the perception of secure voting. Because if the voting is actually secure, frankly, that's too much work. They're constantly going to have to do constant election updates. They're constantly going to have to work on the security. It's easier for them just to, and because, the other component of this is old-fashioned political corruption. I mean, how do you get the voting machine business for a particular area? You go in and you cut deals with politicians, you move some money around, you donate to their campaigns, you do favors for them. You do favors for their relatives, you hire members of their family. It's all the old familiar Biden stuff. And at that point, yes, you get the voting machine contract. Are you any good at actually doing this? No, but you're good at getting voting machine contracts. I mean, this is how it works across a whole range of so-called private-public partnerships. Why do we have ridiculously expensive textbooks in schools? Because the textbook publishers, who are, by the way, some of the same big publishers who are usually owned by European companies, they go out there and they hire people who are actually influential in large school boards, particularly huge ones like over here, LAUSD, New York. They hire these people, and these people then actually serve as their salespeople. They come out there to their old friends and they say, okay, you want to pick these textbooks up? They're only $100 each. And of course, it's the schools then complain, well, we don't have any money. We have no money. We're spending all the money on textbooks. We're spending all the money on iPads. We're trying to hand every student an iPad. All these scams are familiar. I'm not going to delve into them because that's not the topic at the moment, but this is the same stuff that happens with voting machines. Now, these voting machines are not top of the line. They're not very secure, but politicians buy them because deals have been cut. And, for example, with something like Dominion, which Texas repeatedly rejected and other states accepted, well, there's the corruption angle that's about rigging elections. There's also the corruption angle about we stand to make some money from doing this. So let's go ahead and do this. And who cares about the security as long as we keep getting elected? And, Republicans are often just as guilty of this as Democrats, particularly in local politics. So we have, first of all, as I mentioned, an election theft that's happening on multiple levels. It's happening on multiple technical levels as well. There's the brute force voter fraud. There's the high level statistical fraud. And there's a lot of things in between that. Now, a lot of the establishment Republicans are going and saying, there's no way Democrats could coordinate some sort of massive conspiracy like this. They're not smart enough to do that. Admittedly, Joe Biden is not smart enough to do that. Or the people around Joe Biden are not smart enough to do that. But it's not Joe Biden doing this. It's not the people around Joe Biden who are doing this. A lot of these people are indeed stupid and not very bright. But there are people who are actually very bright, because the people who are actually very bright are not running for public office. They're working behind the scenes. They're working for nonprofits. Obviously, Soros comes to mind, Bloomberg comes to mind, a whole bunch of others come to mind, including Warren Buffett and his family and the Rockefeller brothers and so many others. The sheer amount of left-wing so-called nonprofits and activist organizations far outnumber ours. And they have their own agendas, and they have some very smart people. If you look at the organizations that the left has set up, they are indeed very smart. They're very complicated, they're very sophisticated. Now, that doesn't mean these people will necessarily get results, but if you look at the sheer complexity, their ability to control messaging, to bring stuff out as a result, it's quite impressive. It's quite clever. Their networks are extremely sophisticated. Are they capable of coordinating a national conspiracy? Probably yes, but they don't really have to be, because remember, some of the stuff is happening on its own. Ballot fraud in places like Philly and Detroit is just going to happen no matter what. Democrats are going to commit ballot fraud. And you have people independently committing fraud. Thus, for example, Texas busted a social worker at a nursing home who was going out and registering 67 patients, most of whom were mentally disabled in one way or another, and now keep multiplying this. That's not an anecdote. For example, back in the day, there was another anecdote in 2012. David Horowitz of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, our founder, our leader, spoke to his brother, Henry, who was mentally handicapped. And Henry told him he'd been taken on with other patients to go out there and vote for Obama in 2012. I've seen myself, not mentally handicapped people, but I've seen people who are elderly, who have dementia, who are in no way understanding what they're doing, being taken into voting booths and having caretakers vote for them. Particularly when you have unionized caretakers, this stuff happens on a regular basis. And as I mentioned before, this is the old-fashioned fraud that's been happening all along. It does not need to be nationally coordinated. It doesn't need to be coordinated from the top down. Soros doesn't need to be sitting in his James Bond fortress with his little finger in his mouth going, ha, 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 I've got these people stacking ballots. This is stuff that Democrats have been doing for over 150 years. They're going to keep on doing it. They're going to keep on doing them no matter what. And you've got the more sophisticated stuff. Could that stuff be coordinated by technical people? Yes. So the other thing to remember is at this point, the Democrats, particularly the left, are increasingly being taken over by big tech, or at least certainly being infiltrated by big tech. When you look at really a lot of people who are funding the left, they're people who have actually made a lot of money through eBay, through PayPal, and I don't mean they're getting paid through PayPal. I mean, we're talking top executives. There are people who have actually been founders at Facebook, not to mention Mark Zuckerberg, who plans a whole bunch of money in politics. You have top people at Google, including its former CEO, Eric Schmidt, who are all creating these little technical startups. Some of them are very dark. For example, Eric Schmidt's political technical organizations, we're still not clear what they do. Bloomberg put a lot of money into so-called data organizations. So the Democrats have been spending a lot of money on what I would call dark data. We're not entirely clear what these organizations do. They're supposed to do something to influence elections. These organizations have smart people in them. They're coming out of Silicon Valley. And these people might not be politically astute. When it comes to tying their shoes, they might not be very good at it. When it comes to data, they're very good at playing with it. And they're being paid quite a bit of money to play with that data. Now, exactly what happened, we don't know. Part of this is things that we're going to unveil, unpack in the years to come, possibly the decades to come, because this is a very troubling precedent. And this is really what we need to remember. A coup is something that used to happen in foreign countries, it used to happen in third world countries. Now, unfortunately, it's happening in the United States, it's happening here. And it's happening not just because the left is really radical, the left has always been radical. The problem is that the left increasingly has radicalized the Democrats. The Democrats, in turn, have radicalized a lot of major corporations. A huge sector of nonprofit organizations have been built up and networked to carry out the will of people, yes, like Soros, but so many other left-wing billionaires who are buying elections. And really, the state of wealth in this country has shifted dramatically. When you look at where the money is coming from, it is coming from a small number of major companies. It is coming from the government, which is why around the Obama administration, suddenly all the bedroom communities around DC were some of the wealthiest places in the country. The middle class is being hollowed out. The middle class is being destroyed. The working class, particularly manufacturing, is being destroyed. This is why these people, particularly in the working class in the Rust Belt, have come out for President Trump. It's why the elections have become such a game changer. Because, yes, this is about the nature of America. It's about the toppling of the statues of our founding fathers. It's about the destruction of the Constitution, but it's also about dollars and cents, and this is something we need to do. We need to follow the money. This is about economic power. The people who have the economic power are backing Biden. The people who don't have it are backing Trump. This is very much a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, and the people who are on the right and still have, well, that's a matter of time, because as the economy gets consolidated, as government takes control of more and more of the economy, it's going to be able to reward its supporters more, and it's going to be able to shut out people who are conservatives more and more. This is the game plan. And when Biden talks about consolidating, taking control of coronavirus policy, that means that just as with the so-called recovery under Obama, they're going to be able to decide who can stay open and who can't, which industries can stay open and which can't. And do you think they're going to be able to do that in order to benefit their backers, including Amazon, including various companies like AT&T, which very much played a role in this election? AT&T, by the way, is the corporate parent of CNN. Are they going to crush small businesses that are more conservative? Are they going to crush more conservative areas? You bet they will. They're absolutely going to do that. And that's part of what's at stake here. This is a coup by the people who have the power and the money. And like so many coups, they expect us to accept it, to stay quiet, to obey, to be very good. As Obama liked to say, this is who we are. This is who we are. Coups are not what happens. CNN gets to decide who actually is the president, and we're supposed to stay quiet. And the media gets to proclaim who wins elections. They get to decide for us, and tech companies get to decide what we can say. And the Democrats, we have to create a one-party state, not just in California and New York, but across the United States. And all of us, we're supposed to stay quiet. Now, the good news, it's the same good news I began with, is that President Trump isn't staying quiet. He's fighting back. And so many of you, those of you who are here, you're fighting back. You're not staying quiet. You're not accepting this. You're not going into the night and going, okay, well, we just have to accept the results and we'll try again in 4 years. Yes, if we end up not being able to do this, we'll try again in 2 years and we'll try again in 4 years and we'll keep trying. But the important thing to remember is that we're not giving up, not now, not ever, because the way you don't give up in 4 years is you don't give up right now. So many establishment Republicans think in terms of, well, we're going to try again in 4 years, we're going to try again in 2 years. But if you're not willing to fight right now, you're not going to fight in 2 years, you're not going to fight in 4 years either. There's always going to be an excuse. There's a German proverb, heute, morgen, nur nicht heute, sagen alle Leute, Leuten, which essentially means that all the lazy people are always going to say, we're going to do this tomorrow. I'm going to pay you Thursday for a burger right now. I'm not going to do this right now. This has been the curse of the Republican establishment. We're going to do this in 2 years from now. We're going to do this in 4 years from now. No, by fighting now, we're going to ensure that we're going to do this in 2 years from now. We're going to do this in 4 years from now, and then we're going to keep on fighting. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for listening. I look forward to hearing your comments and your questions.
As always, brilliant. And I agree, if you don't mind me quickly going back to my motherland, if people would fight back then, they wouldn't have to keep on trying and fighting for 41 years to get their freedom back. So I agree, we should keep fighting for sure.
Exactly.
Before I start reading the question, I have a question, Daniel. How did elected President Biden suddenly solve all the BLM and Antifa problems in few days? Because I haven't heard of a single riot or looting or any problems. Where did they all go?
You know, President-elect Biden has magical powers. Not only did he get rid of all the riots, he also got rid of the coronavirus. Now we're saying Fauci's coming out and saying, you know, the pandemic's going to go, everything's going to be fine very soon. So all the problems, and I mean, this would be a whole other discussion, but the bottom line is the Democrats set out to wreck the economy in 2020 because understood that was the only pathway to defeating President Trump. And, you know, suddenly now all these things are not as much of a problem as they were before.
That is very true. It's interesting. Okay, so question, what do you think is Trump's strongest case to win?
So as I was kind of saying, it's not just the strongest, it's not just the individual case. It's about attacking on multiple fronts, and that's what President Trump is doing. He's chasing down different states. He's not just focusing on one state or 2 states or 3 states. He's chasing down different states. He's chasing down different avenues, which includes straightforward ballot fraud, as I discussed, which includes looking at some of the statistical analysis, because in the past, statistical analysis has never actually been used for a legal ruling, but that's kind of a new area. But it has been used as a basis for court cases, which means that potentially there is an option here.
Fabulous. Okay, for the sake of discussion, let's assume the coup is successful. What's the best, what's the worst that can happen?
Well, we've seen 8 years of Obama, and during 8 years of Obama, what we've seen is the IRS being used against political opponents. We've seen economic warfare being used against political opponents. We've seen Watergate coming back 10,000-fold with eavesdropping. By the way, this eavesdropping did not just start with the 2016 election. It's been going on for quite a while before that. We know the members of Congress were eavesdropped on before by the NSA. Information was passed on to the Obama White House. And this was just during those 8 years. The military was effectively trashed. Radicals were put into place in key positions. And the military leadership essentially became obedient to Obama, and our military was in many ways wrecked. They began trying to consolidate control over law enforcement. They did not entirely succeed in that regard, but they still did a lot of damage, and give them 4 more years and they're going to do a lot more damage because, you know, the police defunding is not actually going away. They just don't want to talk about it because it plays very badly. But the same people are absolutely going to get right back on that. The same stuff that Holder was advancing is going to go through there, which means, again, making sure that every police department gets run through DC answers to DC, answers to the Department of Justice, at least when the Democrats are running it, and that the radicals and that the criminals get to have their fun. And that's just a taste. I mean, we've seen 8 years of Obama, but we're not going to begin in 2008. We're going to begin in 2021, and we're going to see just how bad it's going to be, because we're picking up not only where Obama left off, but where the Democrats and the radicals left off during the 4 years of President Trump. So suffice it to say, it's going to be bad.
Let me ask you a foreign question since you brought that up. I don't know if you heard or not, but as I was watching the Islamic Republic of Iran's broadcasting TV, I heard that the Secretary of Defense of Islamic Republic of Iran came out and said, with the biggest smile, congratulations to President Biden. Actually, they refer to him as president now in Iran. And then he went on to say, Biden administration has to apologize to us, lift all the recent sanctions, pay us for the damages of last 4 years of sanctions, then we might go back and negotiate. What are your thoughts on that?
They know exactly who they're dealing with. When it comes to Iran, Biden is even worse than Obama. And that's saying a lot, because the Iran lobby has been paying him for quite a while. Well, before this, they picked a very good horse to invest in. One of the fun facts that I like to recite that really should have been articulated by the Trump campaign is that after September 11th, Biden turned around and said, we should send a $200 million check to Iran. Obviously, the Obama-Biden administration sent a lot more money than that. But this was his reaction to September 11th attacks, is we should send $200 million to terrorists so that they actually like us more. Biden has been headlining Iran lobby events. He's been getting money from the Iran lobby. So he's the minute, if he were actually to be able to get in there, he is absolutely going to, first of all, turn the money pipeline back on. He was actually saying this even during the election. One of his first Medium posts written on his behalf was that Iran, to deal with the coronavirus, needs access to the international banking system. So the money pipeline gets turned back on. And this is, even though we right now know that Iran has been violating everything quite a bit, they're going to continue supporting Iran's nuclear program, which, despite their claims, is actually happening without any actual inspection on the ground. And they're going to do everything that they can to break up the deals that have been forged between Israel and some of the Sunni Arab countries against Iran, because they want to break up this coalition.
Exactly. Why did Netanyahu congratulate Biden so early? If Trump wins, will that poison the relationship with Israel?
It's possible. What Netanyahu was dealing with internal political calculations, which is that, if you recall, during the Obama years, they did everything possible to scapegoat Netanyahu. Their plan was, like the Clinton administration, to force him out of office. They didn't actually succeed. But what really is going to happen if Biden actually comes in is Biden is going to once again resume the Obama policy of going after Netanyahu. And Netanyahu is heading off domestic criticism, because the domestic critics are going to say, if Netanyahu hadn't actually congratulated him, the relations would be good. But now that he didn't congratulate him, because of that, we actually have bad relations. We need to get Netanyahu out of there. So it's a domestic political calculation. I agree, it looked bad. It was not a good way to handle things.
Got it. Okay, these two questions are kind of close to each other, so I'm going to merge them into one. Do you think it's likely that court fights will reduce Biden's victory count enough or delay past the December 14 electoral college deadline? And do you have confidence in President Trump to get the Democrat fraud all the way to the Supreme Court? And if so, then ultimately winning?
So I think there are good odds of eventually getting it to the Supreme Court. The electoral college deadline is obviously a bit of a ticking clock, so everybody's racing against the clock. But one of the things that the Democrats are doing is trying to force the lawyers that are challenging it on behalf of Trump, on behalf of the GOP, to drop out. This is very blatant intimidation, which means that they are worried. I mean, they wouldn't have to be going after these lawyers if they were not worried. The fact that they're doing this means that they are worried, that the Democrats or themselves and the media are admitting that there's a possibility that Trump could get it through. But don't get me wrong, this is going to be very hard. It is going to be very challenging. There are absolutely no certainties. Don't listen to people who are telling you that it's a sure thing. It is absolutely not a sure thing. It is going to be a hard battle. It is going to have to be a very creative battle. And it's going to require getting past some federal judges who are, frankly, Obama appointees who are going to be incredibly, incredibly hostile. And, you know, and particularly in DC, when it comes to that, you've got judges who are party line judges. So it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge battling this in different states. But they're going to try taking this to federal courts because the state courts are obviously going to be very bad. You don't want to fight this in state court in Pennsylvania. You don't want to fight this in state courts, for that matter, in Michigan or in Wisconsin. Well, Wisconsin is a bit better, but still you want to get this to federal courts and you want to push this up the ladder to the point that it reaches the Supreme Court. Now, Roberts is not going to want this. Roberts is probably hoping that this burns out, that he's not actually going to have to deal with this. There are probably some kind of fair weather conservative justices or really Republican justices that are hoping that they're not going to have to deal with this. But the bottom line is, I think it is going to get to the Supreme Court. The question is how prepped it will be, how much evidence they'll have, and how good their arguments will be.
Okay, with that, would you give us a, okay, let me expand that question. There are two possible scenarios. Trump wins, Biden wins at the end of the day, correct?
One would hope.
Exactly. So as an American, as an average American, right now, Daniel, my biggest problem is I am questioning our vote system so badly that I don't even see a point of going and voting again. My head goes, either whatever the result, this mess they have created so much doubt inside me as an American. Do you have any solution, any answer to that problem? Where do we go from here as a nation, as a country? How do we fix these messes they keep creating?
So there are two answers to that. Obviously, a lot of people are feeling very, very disappointed and very unhappy with the situation. And yes, voting only has so much of an effect. It only has so much of an effect in certain very blue states. But at the same time, voting is about actually trying to bring change, but it's also, frankly, a reminder that the left isn't in charge of everything, the Democrats are not in charge of everything. When you're voting, you're reminding them. I mean, in the Soviet Union, for example, you had elections that were utterly meaningless. You could vote yes or no on something. The people who actually came out there and voted no were doing something dangerous. They were risking their freedom, they were risking their lives to go out there and make a form of protest. You know, when we vote, I mean, I've lived pretty much all my life, no, I've lived all my life in the United States, voting in places where voting practically doesn't matter. Still going out there and voting for the Republican side, voting for the right thing is, first of all, it's an act of resistance. It's a way of saying, you don't actually control us, you don't run our lives. Now, on the other issue, our voting system is very terrible. I mean, our voting system is in some ways, it's a hybrid of an 18th century, 19th century system that is absolutely unready for the present time. And Democrats and Republicans both want it that way. They want a broken system. I mean, the bottom line is I can pick up my phone now, push a button, order something in 2 minutes and have it delivered and have the charge to my credit card with absolutely no problem. We have a ridiculously backward voting system, not because we aren't capable of doing better, because we don't want to do better. So for example, we don't have voter ID because the Democrats don't actually want voter ID to be there. They don't actually want legitimate voting. They don't want to actually stop the fraud. Republicans don't want voting to be too accessible because obviously at that point you have a kind of a power shift potentially in some places. So the bottom line is we have a dysfunctional system because it serves the political interest, but the system is ridiculously primitive. And you know, people from other countries where you actually have to show an ID to vote don't understand why there isn't voter ID in America. And the answer is that most people, most Democrats, most Black people support it. Democrats continue blocking it.
Well, I think I'm rushing it because I became a citizen in 2010 and then 2012 was Obama and now Biden and then just in the middle of Trump. So I think I'm getting a little frustrated with, I only got to vote 3 times in America. Okay, we have time for one more question and here it is. Well, they said after Trump wins, how big do you think the riots will be? And can President Trump put them down?
Oh, if President Trump wins, I think there will definitely be riots, but it won't be quite as tactical as the riots that we've seen before, because the riots we've seen in 2020 was preparing the battle space for the election, and they were backed by a whole bunch of money and activism. The Black Lives Matter people are not going to be staging massive riots because at that point, there's no point to it. If you look at the history of the riots, the big ones have been around election years. They've been very explicitly about attempts to actually suppress the vote, manipulate the election, terrorize people. So the crazies will definitely riot. They'll march in DC. They'll wear their pink hats. They'll scream at the sky. But the effectiveness will be much less. Antifa will be doing some damage. But without the protective coloration of Black Lives Matter, they'll be very easy to deal with.
Understandable. Okay. Daniel, tell everyone, I know everybody already knows, but to make sure, tell everybody where to go to follow you, read your work, get more educated on what's going on.
Well, I'm honored to be a part of David Horowitz Freedom Center at frontpagemag.com. From David Horowitz on down, so many people there are doing fantastic work. And if you just go to frontpagemag.com, you can see so much of the work that's going out there. And there's so much out there beyond, well beyond my work. There are people who are researching, they're digging into information, they're fighting, and they're fighting the good fight. And, thank you for being part of it. Whether you're actually receiving our emails on a regular basis, whether you've attended the weekends in the past, whether you've attended our events, whether you've just attended the virtual ones, I hope you keep coming. I hope you keep attending the next webinar, which will be with somebody else who will no doubt be amazing and talented, and will also be hosted by the amazing and talented Annie. I hope you keep being informed. I hope you keep fighting. I hope you don't give up, because it's so important that we don't give up. We at the Freedom Center are going to keep fighting, and I hope you'll keep fighting too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing your wisdom and information with us again.
Thank you so much, Annie, for doing once again a fantastic job and introducing your own life experience through this story.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And to our audience who has stayed with us until now, thank you so much. We appreciate you being here. And remember, these webinars are brought to you by David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang for free. So if you want to support these webinars, consider going to frontpagemag.com and consider making 100% tax deductible. And as Daniel said, let's not give up on America. We can keep fighting, and we can keep fighting, and we can keep on holding on to our freedoms. With that being said, stay safe, and until next week, goodbye.